Namo Buddhaya, the Satasahasrika Prajnaparamita Sutram, the large sutra on perfect wisdom, the chapter 62nd, the supreme attainment. Subhuti. How, Lord, does the Bodhisattva, having stood on the perfection of morality, acquire the perfection of giving? The Lord. Here the Bodhisattva, the great being, having stood on the perfection of morality, does not adhere by any of his bodily, vocal, or mental engagements to the level of the disciple or Pratyekabuddha. When he stands in this perfection of morality, he doesn't rob beings of life, doesn't take what is not given, etc., too, doesn't have false views. When he has stood in that perfection of morality, then any gift which he gives, whether it be food to those who want food, drink to those who want drink, and likewise cars, clothes, flowers, garlands, perfumes, ointment, lodgings, asylum, livelihood, and services to those who want them. In short, all kinds of things useful to humans, that gift he makes common to all beings and dedicates it to full enlightenment, but not to the level of the disciples or Pratyekabuddhas. Subhuti. How does the Bodhisattva, having stood in the perfection of morality, acquire the perfection of passions? The Lord. Here the Bodhisattva, the great being, who has stood in the perfection of morality, when all beings cut off all his limbs, never gets angry or feels ill will, but just thinks to himself, how good it is that this should have happened to me. For through my renunciation of this stinking body, I shall win the heavenly, the adamantine body of the Tathagata. Subhuti. How does the Bodhisattva, having stood in the perfection of morality, acquire the perfection of vigor? The Lord. Here the Bodhisattva, the great being, doesn't relax his physical and mental vigor, and he is determined that he will rescue all beings from samsara and establish them in the deathless element. Subhuti. How does the Bodhisattva, having stood in the perfection of morality, acquire the perfection of concentration? The Lord. When the Bodhisattva, the great being, enters on the trances, he doesn't hang on to the level of the disciples or Pratyekabuddhas, but thinks to himself that having stood here in the perfection of concentration, I should liberate all beings from samsara. Subhuti. How does the Bodhisattva, the great being, having stood in the perfection of morality, acquire the perfection of wisdom? The Lord. Here the Bodhisattva, the great being, having stood in the perfection of morality, doesn't see any Dharma as conditioned or conditioned. He doesn't see existence as conditioned or non-existence as unconditioned. He doesn't see the sign as conditioned or the signless as unconditioned. He doesn't review the beingness or non-beingness of any Dharma except in such a way that he doesn't transgress against the suchness of all Dharmas. And through that perfection of wisdom and skill and means, he doesn't fall on the level of a disciple or Pratyekabuddha. Subhuti. How does the Bodhisattva, having stood in the perfection of passions, acquire the perfection of giving? The Lord. As the Bodhisattva, from the first thought of enlightenment onwards and up to his being seated on the terrace of enlightenment, gives gifts if all beings should abuse and revile him and cut him limb from limb. Still firmly established in the perfection of passions, he thinks to himself, I should give to these beings, not should I not give gifts. To those who want food, he gives food, etc. Having made these wholesome roots common to all beings, he dedicates them to the knowledge of all modes, but in such a way that the triple intellectual act doesn't take place concerning him who dedicates that which dedicates that whereto it is dedicated. Subhuti. How does the Bodhisattva, having stood on the perfection of passions, acquire the perfection of morality? The Lord. Here the Bodhisattva, the great being, beginning with the first thought of enlightenment until he is seated on the terrace of enlightenment, he doesn't rob any being of life, doesn't take what is not given, etc. Too, he has not false views, and his thought doesn't stride forth to the level of the disciples of Pratyekabuddhas, and he makes these wholesome rules common to all beings and dedicates them to full enlightenment as before. Subhuti. How does the Bodhisattva, the great being, having stood in the perfection of passions, acquire the perfection of vigor? The Lord. Here the Bodhisattva, the great being, having stood in the perfection of passions, generates vigor in this manner. I will travel for 1 mile, for 100 miles, or up to a distance of thousands of kotis of world system for the sake of one single being, whom I could establish in the art of taking refuge with a triple jewel in the moral rules, or in passions, or in the fruit of a stream winner, etc., to in full enlightenment. So he should exert vigor, and having made these wholesome roots common to all beings, he dedicates them to the supreme enlightenment. Subhuti, how does the Bodhisattva, the great being, having stood in the perfection of passions, acquire the perfection of concentration? Lord, here Subhuti, the Bodhisattva, the great being, having stood in the perfection of passions, detached from sense desires, detached from evil and unwholesome dharmas, dwells in the attainment of the first trance, which is with thoughts adjusted and discursive, born of detachment, full of rapture in these, and so he dwells in all trances up to the fourth and up to the attainment of cessation. All those dharmas which constitute thought of its concomitants and which are connected with wholesomeness, he dedicates to the knowledge of all modes, but in such a way that on that occasion he doesn't apprehend the trances of their limbs. Subhuti, how does the Bodhisattva, having stood in the perfection of passions, acquire the perfection of wisdom? The Lord, having stood in the perfection of passions, the Bodhisattva dwells as one who surveys dharmas in their modes as isolated, calm and non-extinct. But he doesn't realize their dharmahood until he is seated on the terrace of enlightenment, and there wins the knowledge of all modes immediately thereafter to turn the wheel of Dharma. It is thus that the Bodhisattva, the great being, having stood in the perfection of passions, acquires the perfection of wisdom, but in such a way that he neither rejects it nor seized upon it. Subhuti, how does the Bodhisattva, having stood in the perfection of vigor, acquire the perfection of giving? The Lord, here the Bodhisattva, having stood in the perfection of vigor, doesn't either in bodily or thought lay aside his duties. Without any doubt, should I know full enlightenment, not should I not know it. Firmly established in the perfection of vigor, he travels for the sake of beings for 1 mile, etc., over the distance of hundreds and thousands of quotas of world systems, if only to bring just one single being to enlightenment. If he can find no persons belonging to the Bodhisattva vehicle, he will establish a person belonging to the disciple vehicle in discipleship, or one belonging to the Pratyekabuddha vehicle in Pratyekabuddhahood. One single being, even he established in the 10 wholesome paths of action. Having given that gift of Dharma, he gratifies beings also with material gifts. He doesn't, however, dedicate that wholesome root to the level of disciples or Pratyekabuddhas, but having made in common to all beings, dedicates it to full enlightenment. Subhuti, how does the Bodhisattva, having stood in the perfection of vigor, acquire the perfection of morality? The Lord, here the Bodhisattva, beginning with the first thought of enlightenment until he is seated on the terrace of enlightenment himself, abstains from taking life, and also others he includes to abstain, induces to abstain from taking life. He speaks in praise of the obsession of taking life, and he praises also those other people who abstain from taking life, one acquiescent, etc. He himself abstains from wrong views, and also others he induces to abstain from them. He speaks in praise of the abstention from wrong views, and he praises also those others who abstain from wrong views, one acquiescent. But through that perfection of morality, he doesn't base himself on the world of sense desire, the world of form, or the formless world, no, on the level of the disciples or Pratyekabuddhas, but he makes these wholesome roots common to all beings and dedicates them to full enlightenment as before. Subhuti, how does the Bodhisattva, having stood in the perfection of vigor, acquire the perfection of passions? The Lord, as the Bodhisattva, the great being, advances from the first thought of enlightenment to his seat on the terrace of enlightenment, if a man or ghost distracts his mind, or in his limbs are cut off from his body and carried away, the Bodhisattva firmly establishes in the perfection of vigor and doesn't think someone cuts or breaks or kills me, but on the contrary, he thinks to himself, how fortunate that just this should destroy my body, for whose sake I look after it. or he learns to attend well to the true nature of dharmas, and he doesn't dedicate these wholesome roots to the level of the disciple of Pratyekabuddhas, but having made them common to all beings, dedicates them to the supreme enlightenment. Subhuti, how does the Bodhisattva, having stood in the perfection of vigor, acquire the perfection of concentration? The Lord. Here, the Bodhisattva, the great being, enters on the trances. They are limited, the formless attainment, but he doesn't take hold of their karma result. He is reborn only where he can work the will of beings, whom he matures through the six perfections. He passes on from Buddha field to Buddha field for the sake of honoring the Buddhas and Lords and on plant and wholesome roots. Subhuti. How does the Bodhisattva, having stood in the perfection of vigor, acquire the perfection of wisdom? The Lord. Here the Bodhisattva, the great being, having stood in the perfection of vigor, doesn't review the perfection of given, etc., as an actual reality or as an existent or as a sign. And so for the applications of mindfulness, etc., to the knowledge of all modes, reviewing all dharmas as without actual reality, existence, or sign. He doesn't make his home in any dharma, and as he speaks, so he acts. Subhuti. How does the Bodhisattva, having stood in the perfection of concentration, acquire the perfection of giving? The Lord. Here the Bodhisattva, the great being, having entered on the trances, etc., having stood in the perfection of concentration, with undistracted mind, gives to beings gifts, both material and spiritual. He himself gives material and spiritual gifts, and others also he instigates to give material and spiritual gifts. He speaks in praise of given material and spiritual gifts, and he praises also those other beings who give them one acquiescent. And those wholesome roots he doesn't dedicate to the level of the disciples of Pratyekabuddhas, but having made them common to all beings, he dedicates them to the supreme enlightenment. Subhuti. How does the Bodhisattva, having stood in the perfection of concentration, acquire the perfection of morality? The Lord. Here the Bodhisattva, the great being, who has stood in the perfection of concentration, doesn't produce a thought connected with greed, hate, delusion, or harming. He dwells only in attention associated with the knowledge of all modes, and these wholesome roots is it arise before. Subhuti. How does the Bodhisattva, having stood in the perfection of concentration, acquire the perfection of patience? The Lord. Here the Bodhisattva, the great being, having stood in the perfection of concentration, contemplates from as a mass of foam, feeling as bubble, perception as a mirage, the drives as a plantain tree, consciousness as like a mock show. When he contemplates thus, the conviction is set up in him that the five grasping skandhas are insubstantial, and when he thus contemplates, he thinks to himself, when all my limbs are cut off, who is it that cuts? Or what is it that is being cut? Whose is the body? Who's the feeling? Who's this perfection? Who's the drives? Who's the consciousness? When he thus contemplates, he thinks to himself, who is that relieves? Who is it that reviles or abuses or feels ill will when reviled or abused? Subhuti. How does the Bodhisattva, having stood in the perfection of concentration, acquire the perfection of vigor? The Lord. Here the Bodhisattva, the great being, who has stood in the perfection of concentration, enters into the first, second, third, and fourth trances. He doesn't take up the sign of those trances and trance limbs, and with a thus concentrated thought, he experiences the various kinds of psychic power. With a heavenly ear element, he hears sounds both heavenly and human. Likewise, he wisely knows the thought of other beings and persons, etc. He wisely knows as it really is, a thought without anything above it, as a thought without anything above it. He remembers his various previous lives. With a heavenly eye pure and surpassing that of man, he sees beings as they die and are reborn, etc. He sees the beings fare according to their deeds. This should be worked out in detail. Based on these five superknowledges, he passes on from Buddha field to Buddha field, honoring the Buddhas and Lords, planting wholesome roots, maturing beings, and purifying the Buddha field. And he doesn't dedicate these wholesome roots to the level of the disciples and Pratyekabuddhas as before. Subhuti. How does the Bodhisattva having stood in the perfection of concentration acquire the perfection of wisdom? The Lord. Here the Bodhisattva, the great being, having stood in the perfection of concentration, doesn't apprehend form or any of the other skandhas of the perfections, the applications of mindfulness, etc., to the knowledge of all modes, the conditioned element, the unconditioned element. Not apprehending them, he doesn't put them together, but putting them together, he doesn't produce or stop them. And why? Because whether the Tathagatas are produced or not, firmly established is the established order of these dharmas, firmly established in the dharma element that is neither produced nor stopped. Undistracted in his thought, he becomes one who is not lacking in attentions associated with the knowledge of all modes. Subhuti. How does the Bodhisattva, having stood in the perfection of wisdom, acquire the perfection of giving? The Lord. Here the Bodhisattva, the great being, coursing in the perfection of wisdom, reviews all dharmas as empty. Subhuti. How does he do so? The Lord. Here, Subhuti, the Bodhisattva, the great being, coursing in the perfection of wisdom, doesn't apprehend the inward emptiness as inward emptiness, etc. For 14 kinds of emptiness, up to the emptiness of own marks. Having stood in these 14 kinds of emptiness, the Bodhisattva, the great being, doesn't apprehend form as empty or not empty, nor anything else up to the unconditioned element. Coursing in this perfection of wisdom, the Bodhisattva, the great being, doesn't review the gift which he gives, whether it be food, etc., or anything else as empty, nor does he review him who gives or him to whom he gives as empty. There is then no occasion for thoughts of meanness or acquisitiveness. And why? There are no such discriminations for the Bodhisattva who courses in perfect wisdom, beginning with the first thought of enlightenment up to his being seated on the terrace of enlightenment. Just as no thought of meanness or acquisitiveness arises to the Tathagata who has known full enlightenment, just so with the Bodhisattva who courses in perfect wisdom. Does this perfection of wisdom as the teacher of the Bodhisattva, the great being? Subhuti. How does the Bodhisattva, having stood in the perfection of wisdom, acquire the perfection of morality? Lord. Here the Bodhisattva, the great being, having stood in the perfection of wisdom, gives no opportunity to the thoughts of the disciples or Pratyekabuddhas. And why? Because he doesn't apprehend the level of the disciples and Pratyekabuddhas, nor the thought which he would dedicate to the level of the disciples or Pratyekabuddhas. From the first thought of enlightenment till the trace of enlightenment, he demonstrates Dharma so that the taking of life might be forsaken. He himself abstains from taking life, etc., as before. And through that morality, he doesn't adhere to any dharma, to discipleship, Pratyekabuddhahood, or Buddhahood, how much less into any other. Subhuti. How does the Bodhisattva, having stood in the perfection of wisdom, acquire the perfection of passions? Lord. Here, Subhuti, there arises to the Bodhisattva, the great being, who has stood in the perfection of wisdom, the adaptable passions. And he thinks to himself, no dharma is here produced or stopped, is born, grows old, or dies, is abused or reviled, cut, broken, or struck. From his first thought of enlightenment up to the terrace of enlightenment, whenever any being may abuse or revile him, cut or break him by belaboring him with claws, sticks, fists, or swords, he thinks to himself, this dharmahood of dharmas. For there is no dharma here that is abused or reviled, cut, broken, struck, or bound. Subhuti. How does the Bodhisattva, having stood in the perfection of wisdom, acquire the perfection of vigor? Lord. Here the Bodhisattva, the great being, having stood in the perfection of wisdom and in the four bases of the psychic power, endowed with skill and means, generates physical and mental vigor, travels over the distance of one world system, etc., to hundreds of thousands of newtons of God as a world system, and demonstrates the dharmas which act as the wings to enlightenment, the fruits of the holy life, but in such a way that he established them neither in the conditioned nor in the unconditioned element. Subhuti. How does the Bodhisattva, having stood in the perfection of wisdom, acquire the perfection of concentration? The Lord. Here the Bodhisattva, the great being, having stood in the perfection of wisdom, enters on all the concentrations, as many as there are be they those of the disciples, the Pratyekabuddhas, or the Bodhisattvas, with the exception of those of the Tathagatas. Having studied these concentrations in direct and reverse order, he enters on and emerges from the 8 deliverances. Which 8? 1. Here the Bodhisattva, the great being, having form, sees forms. 2. Not perceiving inward form, he sees outward forms. 3. He becomes resolved on the lovely. 4. Completely overcoming all perceptions of form by the going to rest of the perception of impact, by not attending to the perception of manifoldness, thinking endless space, he dwells in the attainment of endless space. 5. By completely overcoming the station of endless space and thinking infinite consciousness, he dwells in the attainment of the station of infinite consciousness. 6. By completely overcoming the station of infinite consciousness and thinking that there is not anything, he dwells in the attainment of the station of the field of nothing whatever. 7. By completely overcoming the station of nothing whatever, he dwells in the attainment of the station of neither perception nor non-perception. 8. To having in every way overcome the station of neither perception and non-perception, he dwells in the attainment of the trance of the cessation of perception and feeling. And in direct and reverse order, he enters on the 9 attainments of successive stations and emerges from them. Which 9? The 4 trances, the 4 formless attainments, the trance of the cessation of perception or feeling. Having made a classification of these 8 deliverances and of the 9 attainments of successive stations, he enters on this concentration which is like the lion's yawn. The path of development, the crowning assault. And what Subhuti is of the Bodhisattva, the great being, the concentration which is like the lion's yawn. Here Subhuti, the Bodhisattva, detached from sense pleasures, detached from evil and unwholesome dharmas, dwells in the attainment of the first trance, which is with thought adjusted and discursive, born of detachment, full of rapture and this. So he dwells in all the trances up to the attainment of the cessation of feeling and perception. Having emerged from the attainment of cessation, he enters into the attainment of the station of neither perception nor non-perception, and so descending one by one, he enters the first trance. Having made a classification of this concentration, which is like the lion's yawn, he enters into the concentration which represents the crowning assault. And what is a bodhisattva's concentration, which represents the crowning assault? Here, a bodhisattva detached from sense pleasures, detached from evil and unwholesome dharmas, dwells in the attainment of the first trance, which is with thoughts adjusted and discursive, born of detachment, full of rapture, and these emerged from it. He dwells in all the trances up to the attainment of the station of neither perception nor non-perception. Emerged from the attainment of the station of neither perception nor non-perception, he enters on the attainment of the cessation of feeling and perception. Emerges from that, he dwells in the attainment of the second trance. Emerged from the second trance, he enters in the attainment of cessation. Emerged from that, he enters on the third trance. Emerged from that, he enters on the attainment of cessation. Emerged from that, he enters on the fourth trance. Emerged from that, he enters on the attainment of cessation. Emerged from that, he enters on the attainment of the station of endless space. Emerged from that, he enters on the attainment of cessation. Emerged from that, he enters on the station of infinite consciousness. Emerged from that, he enters on the attainment of cessation. Emerged from that, he enters on the attainment of the station of nothing whatever. Emerged from that, he enters on the attainment of cessation. Emerged from that, he enters on the attainment of the station of neither perception nor non-perception. Emerged from that, he enters on the attainment of cessation. Emerged from that, he enters on the attainment of the station of neither perception nor non-perception. Emerged from the attainment of the station of neither perception nor non-perception. He falls into unconcentrated thought. From unconcentrated thought, he enters into the attainment of cessation. Emerged from the attainment of cessation, he abides in unconcentrated thought. From unconcentrated thought, he enters into the attainment of cessation. Emerged from that, he abides in unconcentrated thought. From unconcentrated thought, he enters on the attainment of the station of neither perception and non-perception. Emerged from that, he abides in unconcentrated thought. From unconcentrated thought, he enters on the attainment of the station of nothing whatever. Emerged from that, he abides in unconcentrated thought. From unconcentrated thought, he enters on the attainment of the station of infinite consciousness. Emerged from that, he abides in unconcentrated thought. From unconcentrated thought, he enters on the attainment of the station of endless space. Emerged from that, he abides in unconcentrated thought. From unconcentrated thought, he enters on the fourth trance. Emerged from that, he abides in unconcentrated thought. From unconcentrated thought, he enters on the third trance. Emerged from that, he abides in unconcentrated thought. From unconcentrated thought, he enters on the second trance. Emerged from that, he abides in unconcentrated thought. From unconcentrated thought, he enters on the first trance. Emerged from that, he abides in the unconcentrated thought. After he has stood in this concentration, which represents the crowning assault, he reaches the sameness of all dharmas. It is thus that the Bodhisattva, the great being, having stood in the perfection of wisdom, acquires the perfection of meditation. This is the end of 62nd chapter of the Large Sutra on Perfect Wisdom, the Satasahasrika Prajnaparamita Sutram.